Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, coming at you with a little bit of a different take on video content this time around. We're going to do a little bit of an in-depth discussion on a particular archetype, this time starting out with Mono Green Karn, a deck that a couple weeks ago came back with a Roar of Vengeance as a new combo was discovered with Pestilent Cauldron, and the deck placed a lot of good things for about a week or so, and now it's kind of died back down as people remembered how to combat the deck and people adjusted to dealing with the deck. So first up, what is the deck trying to do? This is a mono green ramp style deck, much akin to something like Tron in the modern format. This is a deck that tries to abuse Nykthos Shrine to Nyx along with green devotion pips, such as your Land of War Elves, your Elvish Mystics, your Old Growth Trolls, Cavalier Thorns to create an arbitrarily large amount of mana and do some very broken things with it. The deck's kind of broken down into a couple different categories. You have your ramp, you have your mid-range threats, and then you have your over-the-top kind of end-the-game things. As far as your ramp, you start out with 4 copies of Elvish Mystic and 4 copies of Land of War Elves. Obviously, the most efficient play you can have on turn 1 is you want to go 1 to 3, etc. And Mono does that. Some of the variants of Jund Sacrifice do that. So it's a very powerful play, but this is the deck that is probably the best at abusing it, but also a little bit less vulnerable than some of the other ones as far as skipping their 2 and 3 mana plays. Also, you get to play one of the better cantrips in the format in Oath of Nissa. While this can miss in the A4 deck with other copies of Oath of Nissa and Storm of the Festival, oftentimes you get at least 2 choices out of your Oath of Nissa. Often you're looking for a land or another mana dork. And then, as far as the rest of your mana dorks and such, you have copies of Sylvan Caryatid, which is very good against decks that are trying to remove all of your ramp and kind of stifle you in that way. And Wolfwillow Haven allows you to play potentially on turn 2. If you've got mana dork 1/1, you do hit a land drop, you can potentially have 5 mana worth of plays that turn, or 4 mana worth of plays on you that turn. And then the final bit of your ramp in and of itself is Kiora Behemoth Beckoner. This is a planeswalker that only ticks down on loyalty, comes in with 7 loyalty. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So your Old Growth Trolls and Cavalier Thorns will trigger this, as well as some of the stuff in your sideboard. Basically, this is a nice little cantrip thing, while also being a ramp, especially with your Wolfwillow Havens and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. So once you get beyond that, your ramp really comes down to putting pips on the battlefield in the form of Old Growth Troll and Cavalier of Thorns. Old Growth Troll is kind of a resilient threat, which is quite nice against the controlling decks, and decks once again trying to 1-for-1 you into the ground, as it will whenever it dies, comes back into play and enchants a forest, and you can sack that forest later on. Cavalier Thorns is a 5/6 beefy boy. Whenever it comes down, this threatens to block pretty much everything most decks can throw at it, with a few exceptions. It also fills up your graveyard and potentially can flip over a copy of Storm the Festival, which is quite nice, and allows you to have more readily access to your Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which, once again, I can't get over how powerful and how important this is to this deck. And finally, you come into your payoff portion of things. Your payoff portion of this deck is mostly built around Karn the Great Creator and Storm the Festival. Karn gives you access to a wish board, which many of these decks have run over time. Some of them have gone for other things like Voracious Hydra or such, etc. over time, and it does chew up quite a bit of your sideboard. A lot of people get concerned that maybe you over sideboard with this particular card, and this does restrict your ability to have an actual sideboard. Although being mono green, you don't tend to have access to a lot of different things, but you do give up quite a bit of utility as far as sideboarding to be able to have access to the cards in all 3 games. Nissa also plays into your ability to not only have more threats, but also to increase your mana production with all the basic forests in your deck. And finally, Storm the Festival. This deck is built around using this. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 permanents in the mana value 5 or less. So it's almost collected company for permanents. Obviously, you see 1 less card, but everything in this deck is a permanent, so you're going to see everything put something into play. And once again, helps you define your Nykthos for more busted turns. As far as the mana base, obviously you have access to the forests, which are important. You need turn 1 access to your Elvish Mystics or Land of War Elves. Many of these decks play 20 or 21 lands, depending on if you want access to a 3rd copy of Caryatid, which we'll look at in different lists. But oftentimes they come down to several mana forests, 1 copy of Boseiju, which is a nice utility land to be able to channel to destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land. Then you have 4 copies of Nykthos, which are primarily fuel the deck. You know, this is the thing that really allows you to abuse things, especially if you get your old growth trolls and Cavalier Thorns into play, then you start really netting mana. A lot of times, whenever you're playing and sequencing, something to remember is your Elvish Mystics, your Land War Elves, your Oath of Nisses, especially if you don't already have an Oath of Nisses in play, are net neutral whenever you have a Nykthos in play. Basically, for each point you play, you're gaining a point of mana, so it's really net neutral. And then you can use your Kioras and your Nisses during key turns to untap those things. And the one of Overgrown Tomb is for a part of the sideboard combo, which we'll talk about here in a second. Lair of the Hydra is quite important as a mana sink in the mid to late game, as this deck can flood out with all these amount of mana dorks and such. And then other things, Wolf Haven, don't forget, has the sacrifice to make a wolf. And then Old Growth Troll, whenever it's on a forest, you can sack this forest later to put a 4/4 into play tapped, which is important if you're trying to have a surprise blocker out of nowhere. So, the thing that brought this deck back into contention is a kind of how do I put it? A very convoluted combo. Basically, if you have access to 2 Karns, 2 Kioras, and a Pestilence Cauldron, you can go infinite. So it requires you to have, I believe the count is 13 mana, but realistically 14 for activating Nykthos. You need 4 to cast Karn, 3 to cast Kiora, which is 7, then 12 with Restorative Burst, and then you need 13 mana to net a positive, 14 overall if you want to continuously activate Nykthos. Once you do that, you can infinitely mill your opponent. So the way this combo works is you play a Karn, you go and get it out of your sideboard, you cast Restorative Burst. Restorative Burst, turn up to 2 target creatures, lands, or planeswalker cards from your graveyard to your hand. Each player gains 4 life. Exile Restorative Burst. Okay, so you pick up another Karn, you pick up a Kiora if you have access to one. This allows you to continue netting mana. Now, as you get more devotion in play, Kiora becomes less important. Basically, you need enough mana to loop this probably 10 or 12 times. It's get a little bit annoying on Magic Online, but in paper, you can demonstrate this loop. It's not particularly difficult. You then cast your Kiora, untap your Nykthos, cast your Karn, and then the way Karn is templated, you may reveal an artifact you control from outside the game or choose a face-up artifact you own in exile. So because Restorative Burst exiles itself and goes back to being Cauldron, you can then pick it up again, cast Restorative Burst, and then you kind of get to do this flippy-floppy thing where you're casting Karn Kiora, Restorative Burst, casting another copy of Karn Kiora, Restorative Burst. Gets a little bit monotonous as you're clicking through it on Magic Online. This is a guaranteed kill. You mill out your opponent, you basically kill them from there, and then you gain an arbitrary large amount of life. Then it get very difficult for them to kill you during their upkeep. That is one of the new tech that brought this deck back into notice. And I believe, I want to say it was Canister that came up with it, but I'm not 100% sure on who was the initial designer of it. And the rest of the sideboard is your Karn Wish board, which we'll get into here in a second. Oftentimes, these decks have some amount of interaction for other creature decks or for additional threats that we'll get into in a second as we'll look at a couple other different things. But beyond your Pestilent Cauldron, which we've talked about, there's a lot of different options. Meteor Golem, 7 mana to destroy whatever the heck you want. Godfarer's Statue, this is the thing you use to slow down your opponent, especially if you can get like a rapid start where you get to go like turn 3 Karn, turn 4 Godfarer's Gift. You can lock a lot of people out. Sky Sovereign, this is kind of like your go-to grab in the creature matchups. While it doesn't kill everything, it does significantly help to stabilize the board. Some versions run Darksteel Citadel, some versions run Treasure Vault, some people choose to run neither. Basically, this is a land you can grab off of Karn. Like if you go like turn 3 Karn, but you don't have a land drop, or turn 4 Karn. This allows you to continue progressing your mana while also deploying a Planeswalker. Then you have some number of graveyard hate cards. You know, Tormod's Crypt is kind of your go-to against, you know, whatever type of graveyard shenanigans you're worried about, like maybe Arclight Phoenix having a key turn or something. Cage is very important, not just for graveyard-based decks, but also for Winota. As oftentimes, if you can drop a Karn with a reasonable board presence, and your opponent hasn't gotten to Winota you yet, Karn locks down a Secos Chariot, and then Grafdigger's Cage takes care of the Winota part of things. Oftentimes, that's the key to beating a deck like Winota, is being able to use Karn. Pithing Needle allows you to shut down annoying things, you know, Planeswalkers like Teferi Hero of Dominaria. It's just kind of a nice catch-all. Damping Spheres, depends on how many you want. Realistically, this is primarily for lowest field, as it obviously affects your own Nykthos, and you don't want too many of these effects. But you do want a hate card for that, as they can goldfish nearly as fast as you. And then finally you have Golos, Tireless Pilgrim, which allows you to fetch up Nykthos Shrine to next. I have seen some lists run Cascade Bluffs. I believe that's Cascade. It's the colorless indestructible land that you can tap 5 to make all the colors. Then you can activate Golos. I don't know that that's really necessary, but I've also found that whenever I was playing the deck and watching a lot of other people, that Golos is not a target that you fetch quite often, but I do understand the importance and why it's there. As far as the rest of the sideboard, which most of these decks limit themselves to between 2 and 4 cards, Hunt the Hunter was more relevant when the mirror was a more thing, as one of the things about Hunt the Hunter is it only targets other green creatures. So you have other things like Primal Mite, you know, any other number of fight cards, you know, you could have are quite relevant, but Hunt the Hunter was the most mana efficient for the green mirror. Kenra's Transformation, a lot of people wonder what is the point of this card. One of the worst cards for this deck to face off against is a quick Thing in the Ice, out of especially Is It Phoenix, but also Is It Control to a certain degree. You know, being able to flip, you know, wiping all of your board from existence and then killing one of your key planeswalkers, oftentimes that now allows them to restore enough. And then when you combine it with their early removal, kind of killing your Elvish Mystics and Llanowar Elves, it makes it hard to set back up in time, and then they can just frequently finish you off with either another Thing in the Ice or copies of Arclight Phoenix. This is important to deal with Thing in the Ice before it can flip. That is one of the primary reasons of why Kenra's Transformation is in the deck. As far as other options, I've seen some people do some interesting things like a main deck Ulamog. I've seen things like Helm of something or other. Basically, it copies infinitely. Let me see if I can find it. I want to say it's Helm of Infinite something or others, but Lord only knows. Helm of... Yes, Helm of the Hosts. The beginning of your combat on your turn, create a copy of a token that's equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary if equipped creature is legendary, and that token gains haste. I've seen when I was playing the deck, Meteor Golem copied by Helm of the Hosts. Yeah, that gets a little ugly, but I think it's more cute than good. As far as other variations you'll see on the deck, one version I saw played a copy of Vivian. Now this was kind of a holdover from the older versions of Mono Green before Karn became a main thing and before Cavalier and Storm the Festivals. This will allow you to fetch out green cards out of your sideboard, creatures specifically. Oftentimes you could play like one of Pelucranos or something else. Pelucranos is another card that is quite nice. It's a beefy boy against something like Burn or Winota. It's also quite nice against like blue-white control, etc., giving them yet another threat that they have to answer without having to, you know, resolve planeswalkers against a deck that's going to have thousands and thousands of counterspells in post-board games. So, you know, Pelucranos is another card that you can consider in your sideboard over, you know, the more narrow cards like Hunt the Hunter, and definitely I would consider a Secos Transformation or Kenra's Transformation simply because, you know, Thing in the Ice is definitely a pain in the butt. Another card that I kind of understand but is a huge nombo is the Immortal Sun. Players can't activate Planeswalker loyalty abilities, and when you're primarily a Planeswalker deck, that's a little awkward. In the beginning of your upkeep, draw an additional card. So a very powerful effect, but you do give up the effects on your Planeswalkers. As I was talking about, Treasure Vault was definitely a card that you can see play. This can create a bunch of treasure tokens, or just being an artifact land that you can go fetch. And then another card that I kind of like having access to is the Secos Chariot. This is kind of a nice mid-range threat that makes some tokens. Also, don't forget that there are some tokens you can create. Old Growth Trail is technically a token whenever it comes back into play. So, Chariot, just not the cast itself, isn't the only thing. But, this is a nice card to have access to. And then, we've already talked about Meteor Golem and a bunch of these other cards. And whoever piloted this particular build really, really, really didn't like losing Mono. As far as this version is not really showing anything different other than it's cutting down on some of these for the Kenris transformations, for the blue Nykthos, for the Secos Chariot. And then I think the final one we're going to look at is from this past weekend. And really the only difference is this one's running 20 lands, 3 Caryatids. A lot of it comes down to, do you want to naturally hit your land drops, or do you want to maximize your chance to have early ramp? Whereas the early ramp is very important to the deck. Then finally, Primal Mite is another one of those different fight things you could have. Target creature you control gets +X/+X, and that fights one target creature you don't control. A lot of it comes down to semantics. This one's a little bit more flexible than Hunt the Hunter. And then Succession Petitioner, having a couple copies of this for something like Burn or, to a certain extent, Winota. A lot of it comes down to how many sideboard slots do you want to leave for your Karn Wishboard package, and how many actual green cards do you have. You could also run Voracious Hydra. You could run, is that the old one, Genesis Hydra? I think. Is Genesis Hydra Pioneer legal? I believe it is. But a lot of different cards you can run. As far as how to attack this deck, there's a couple different things you can do. The first thing is attack their early mana, put pressure on the board. Oftentimes that can be enough. Winota with turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Brutal Gathar, take out your Mana Dork, turn 3 Winota, just kind of chipping away and then kind of snowballing from there. That can be a difficult opening to beat. A quick Thing in the Ice out of Is It Phoenix can be difficult. You can also, if you're a controlling deck, you can also try to answer all of their top-end threats with counter spells. Now, that gets a little bit tricky because oftentimes they can go turn 1 Dork, turn 2 Old Growth Troll, turn 3, say, Threat, turn 4 Threat, turn 5 Threat. And eventually the danger becomes is if you don't have a chance to reload as a control deck, do you have enough counter spells? So there are a couple different ways you can attack it, or you can just try to out-combo it with something like Lotus Field, which I believe Lotus Field can go off turn 4 consistently, turn 3 sometimes, which this deck takes a couple turns to set up. So oftentimes that becomes a little bit of a gold fishing thing. And it does, once again, have access to hate cards that can shut down Lotus Field. So as far as attacking the deck, you generally want to be on the tempo-ish, or you can also kind of do it with mono blue spirits a little bit if you have ways to recoup card advantage and have enough counter spells. Once again, this deck is, for a ramp deck, this is one of the better balanced decks as far as having must answer threat, must answer threat, must answer threat. Because a lot of ramp decks historically have the ramp and then the payoffs. This deck has that kind of middle with Kiora and Old Growth Troll and Cavalier Thorns. And none of their threats are that difficult to cast on their own. But the thing to remember about this deck is if you can control their board, you can often deal with their planeswalkers. Kiora, obviously not that big of a threat, although it does, increase their mana. Karn and Nykthos are really the two you gotta keep off the board. Karn, getting to wish for multiple things can oftentimes be game over. Although, unlike a lot of other formats, there's no game ender with Karn in the sideboard. Another card I also wanted to mention, especially if you're playing this in paper, is Heart of Kiran. For the infinite combo, it does require 2 copies of Karn to be accessible. Oftentimes you can only find 1, so you kind of have to continue playing the game a little bit. What Heart of Kiran allows you to do is allows you to crew it multiple times, put the Karn in the graveyard, allows you to pick up the Restorative Burst it back, and so basically Heart of Kiran allows you to go, wish for your, Heart of Kiran, then the key turn cast Heart of Kiran, Restorative Burst, And then you only need 1 copy of Cure or 1 copy of Karn the Great Creator to go infinite. So that is one thing I forgot to mention as I was going through this, and one of the reasons why I picked out this list was I wanted to bring up that particular interaction and why Heart of Kiran can be an important thing. And also, this can be quite a nice way to defend your Planeswalkers. So I would not dismiss Heart of Kiran in your Wishboard packages. As far as sideboarding, this deck really doesn't sideboard a whole lot. The main thing you can trim is, like a Sylvan Caryatid. Sometimes if you're really fearing a lot of like counter spells, or you're going to be under an enormous amount of pressure, sometimes you could consider shaving a Storm the Festival or even a Nissa. Just something, you can even shave a Kiora, although it depends on if you want to have consistent access to the combo in whatever particular matchup you're in, or if you feel your plan A of just going over the top is going to be good enough. And then once again, you're only bringing in a couple cards, whether your creature removal cards, whether it be another threat like Blue Kronos, Voracious Hydra, whatever green creature you have floating around your sideboard. So you're only going to be sideboarding in a couple of cards and sideboarding out a couple of cards. As far as this deck's positioning, from what I've seen both by watching and by playing it a little bit myself, the deck seems to be very good, very explosive, and when people aren't expecting it, it can perform quite well. That said, when this deck is targeted, there are certain decks that can be difficult to. As I mentioned, Izzet-based decks can be difficult, especially with early Thing in the Ice and removal. Winota feels like a reasonable matchup, as most of your good starts are going to beat most of their decent starts. So as far as like nut draw versus nut draw, the Winota deck can win quickly, but this deck's nut draw tends to overpower Nykthos, or tends to overpower Winota, although once again Winota does have some amount of disruption with things like Brutal Cathar, Bone Crusher Giant, etc. The tempo decks and the control decks, if they can get enough counter spells or counter the right spells at the right time, can win, although the kind of pseudo beatdown playing with Old Growth Troll, Cavalier Thorns, and if you have access to Blue Kronos side of the board, can often be enough to wear out their counter spells, as especially the mono blue Spirits deck, if they don't have one of their card draw things going, can oftentimes run out of counter spells. Or oftentimes, because they're conditional counter spells, there are times where in the mid to late game you can generate enough mana that you just laugh at the counter spells and go, okay, I have 14 mana. Your counter 3 or counter unless I pay 3 doesn't do anything. But yeah, this deck is very powerful. I think it's one of the easier decks to understand. The key thing with this deck is sequencing. As far as mana efficiency in the early turns, getting as much as your mana developed as possible, understanding Nykthos math, although on Magic Online it's much easier, and then understanding what's your key turns, and then as you're getting into the Karn turns and the Storm the Festival turns, those are kind of where the bread and butter of the deck. Understanding what card gets you out of the situation, or understand what set of cards get you out of the situation, or how to keep your opponent from coming back in a situation once you're ahead. Say like turn 3, Karn, turn 4, go grab God Pharaoh's statue, and then all of a sudden your opponent can't really do anything, and you can just kind of finish them off quickly from there. That's one of the things when I was playing the deck I struggled with a little bit, was those key turns, like understanding all that. And one thing that is important, when the infinite combo, you do need access to the Overgrown Tomb. Without this deck having a way to produce any color of mana, obviously mainly the green, you do need to get the Overgrown Tomb to be able to cast Pestilent Cauldron, because Restorative Burst happens, and then in order to win the game, you have to play Pestilent Cauldron, and then each opponent mills cards equal to the amount of life you gain this turn, ends the game. But it does require you to have access to that Overgrown Tomb. So if it ends up in the graveyard, that is something to keep in mind, that you really, 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 really need to put this into play at some point, with grabbing it with a Restorative Burst, put it into play. So make sure you have the land drop to do, or you can find it with a Cavalier of Thorns during that key turn. I think that's about the in-depth of what I've learned, both by watching other people play Mono Green Devotion and playing some of it myself. If you do like these kind of deep dives and deep explanations of guides of decks, please consider commenting down below and let me know what you think, as I may be moving away a little bit away from gameplay for now and doing a little bit more of these kind of videos. But I might also start doing some explore gameplay, so we'll see what we can do. But as always, this has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next video.